Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Before there were Eldar, before the Necrontire raised their eyes to the stars, before even the first whisper of the war in heaven, there were others. Their names have been stripped from the annals of all surviving records, not simply lost but purposefully erased, as though the galaxy itself conspired to forget. Yet in the vast and silent dark, there are traces, impossible angles in ancient ruins, fragments of song encoded into the radiation of dead suns, and dreams that do not belong to any living mind. These are not the works of the old ones. These are older still. The thought alone is enough to unnerve even the most jaded rogue trader, for it suggests a truth more terrible than any apocalyptic prophecy, that the galaxy's history is not a linear rise and fall of civilizations, but a graveyard upon a graveyard, each layer hiding the bones of empires so ancient that even gods might not recall their names. And now, something stirs. Strange patterns in warp storms align with distant pulses from beyond the galactic rim. Patrol fleets vanish without a single distress signal. On uncharted worlds, symbols carved in forgotten geometries have begun to hum again, faint but growing. Whatever these first Xenos were, they were not meant to return. Yet the void does not care for what is meant. In the earliest breath of the galaxy's life, before the old ones strode among the stars, the void was a place of violent birth and slow death. Nebulae churned like oceans of fire, gravity pulling raw matter into the shapes of first suns, while the darkness between them was deeper than any night we know. Life did not yet hold dominion here. It was a fragile, accidental thing, clinging to planets spared the worst tempests of creation. Yet even in that crucible, something began to stir. Not the scattered sparks of primitive organisms, but patterns, structures, and intentions that were far too deliberate to be chance. The myths that survive, if they can be called myths, speak of the old ones as architects, engineers of life, who shaped the future like a sculptor shapes clay. But there are those among the most secretive inquisitorial circles who whisper that when the old ones came, they found evidence of builders before them. The galaxy, in this telling, was not theirs to claim, but theirs to inherit. On certain worlds, strata of fossilized cities lie beneath the deepest crust, their age so vast that even geological dating falters. These ruins are often ignored, dismissed as meaningless anomalies. But to those who can read the story of stones, they tell of civilizations impossibly old, rising and falling in ages when the stars themselves were still young. Imagine it. A people born into a galaxy still half-forming, watching the first constellations take shape. Their cities lit by the glow of newborn suns. Their calendars marked not by years, but by the slow drift of entire star clusters. They would have been forced to master survival in an environment so hostile that even the smallest technological lapse could erase them entirely. Perhaps this was why they endured, not by conquest or expansion, but by learning to vanish when danger came, hiding from the cosmic storms that could swallow whole worlds. And in that deep, ancient night, there were no Necrons, no Eldari, no Orcs. The galaxy was empty of all the empires we now know. If the old ones truly arrived to find them, then perhaps the first contact in galactic history was not between gods and mortals, but between two ancient powers, each measuring the other in silence. It is not hard to see why one might choose to vanish from history rather than challenge the other. It is harder still to imagine what they might have learned from watching the old ones and how they might have used that knowledge in secret. When scholars speak of the war in heaven, they speak of it as the oldest known conflict, a titanic struggle between the old ones and the Necrontire, later the Necrons, whose echoes shaped every age that followed. Yet that assumption rests on a dangerous flaw. It presumes that history begins where our surviving records do. What if the war in heaven was not the first war, but merely the first to be remembered? In the dimmest strata of the galaxy's archaeology, in artifacts whose atomic decay places them in a time before any known species walked the stars, there are signs of an older struggle, one fought in silence and shadow. Some xenoarchaeologists, their careers already ruined for pursuing such blasphemy, claim that these earliest builders, whatever their true name, left not just structures, but scars. They point to dead worlds whose crust is marred by symmetrical fissures, planetary-scale fractures that could not have been caused by tectonics or impact. They see in these scars the aftermath of weapons that defy our understanding, the kind of weapons designed not to conquer, but to erase. It is as though these ancient ones fought enemies we cannot imagine, and in winning, ensured that not even a corpse remained to speak of them. This possibility breeds unsettling theories. Could these proto-Xenos have encountered an even older life form, something from the galaxy's gestational chaos, before even the stars had stabilized Earth? Perhaps they were not the first, but merely the first to survive long enough to build. Or perhaps their rivals were never truly destroyed, only banished into dimensions we have yet to name, where they fester still. If so, then the Old One's later mastery of the webway, the warp, and the shaping of life may have been less an act of invention than a desperate appropriation of tools once wielded by these unknown forebears. There is a strange pattern to the placement of their suspected relics. They cluster not around galactic trade routes or resource-rich systems, as later empires would, but along lines that trace invisible arcs through the void. Arcs that correspond to no gravitational map, but resonate eerily with certain warp currents. Some whisper that these alignments mark not trade or conquest, but watchtowers. They may have been positioned to monitor something, or to hold something at bay. If true, then the war in heaven might have been fought in the shadow of an even greater, older vigilance. One that the Old Ones themselves inherited without ever knowing its true purpose. What chills the mind most is not what these echoes tell us, but what they leave unsaid. For all our speculation, there are no direct depictions, no statues, no portraits of these beings. We do not even know what they looked like. That absence feels deliberate, as though their own creators took a hammer to every mirror. Perhaps it was a superstition, perhaps it was strategy, or perhaps, in some unfathomable way, to look upon them was to invite them back. They were not builders in the way we think of builders. Their cities, if they can be called that, were less like the sprawling hives of mankind or the delicate spires of the Eldari, and more like deliberate interruptions in reality itself. Across the blackness, their creations have been found embedded in asteroids, suspended in the upper layers of gas giants, or sunken into the cold crusts of airless moons. Nothing about them is symmetrical to the eye, yet every angle hums with purpose, as if the architecture obeyed a geometry invisible to lesser minds. Some xeno-archaeomancers claim that when you step inside the remnants of these structures, distances shift subtly. Corridors take longer to walk than their length should allow, and rooms appear where no space could exist. Others whisper that in certain chambers, time feels fractionally slower, as though the builders bent the laws of the galaxy for reasons we cannot guess. Whatever they were, their bodies must have been adapted to extremes no other known life could endure. Doorways are narrow yet impossibly tall, as though built for creatures long and lean, their gates stretching across vast distances. There is no sign of written language in any of the recovered sites, suggesting either a mode of communication that left no physical record, or a mental unity that made such tools unnecessary. Imagine a species so attuned to one another that the concept of lying was not only absent but impossible, and yet with minds so alien that no human soul could survive a moment in their thoughts without breaking. Their technology appears fused to their biology in ways that defy categorization. Devices are grown as much as they are forged, living metals that react to touch, crystalline nodes that seem to breathe faintly when approached, and resonant constructs that respond to sound or heartbeat. This was not simply machinery, it was a symbiosis, an extension of their own physicality, perhaps even their consciousness. If the Eldari wove beauty into every creation, and the Necrons forged death into theirs, then these first Xenos wove themselves into their works, inseparable from what they built. Philosophically, if their ruins can be said to express philosophy at all, they seem to have had no notion of individual dominance or empire. The structures serve no obvious central hub, no ruling seat, no fortification for military command. Instead, they give the impression of a civilization concerned with alignment with one another, with the stars, with forces deeper than either. They may have seen themselves not as conquerors or custodians, but as participants in some vast, slow-moving design, one that required them to be in precise positions across the galaxy. And yet there is an undeniable undertone of warning in their work. Every known artifact is situated in a place of cosmic instability, near volatile warp tides, black hole edges, or regions of high radiation. It is almost as if their purpose was not to harness these dangers, but to stand sentinel over them, to maintain a kind of balance. If so, then their absence now is not just a matter of historical curiosity. It is a void in the galaxy's defenses, and whatever they guarded against has been left unopposed for an eternity. The first time they reached out to the galaxy, it must have been a moment unlike any other. Not the brazen, thunderous arrival of fleets demanding surrender, nor the cold arrogance of a species declaring its supremacy, but something stranger. Imagine the young stars in their infancy, their systems barely coalesced, and somewhere on the farthest edge of known matter, a signal arises, a pattern so complex it could not be mistaken for the language of nature. It does not demand, it does not invite. It simply exists, as if stating, "We are here," and waiting to see who would answer. To those who detected it, this signal may have been both a beacon and a test. Perhaps the earliest spacefaring races, those long since gone to dust, responded in kind, sending their own messages out into the black. Perhaps they expected a dialogue, the trading of ideas and technologies, the building of alliances. What they received instead may have been something far more unsettling, not a reply in words, but in presence. Without warning, ships that were more like fragments of void itself began to appear in their skies, absorbing light, distorting gravity around them. They did not attack, yet they did not approach as supplicants. They arrived as if they already belonged there. The effect on these young civilizations is impossible to overstate. Many may have seen the visitors as gods, their shapes impossible to fully comprehend, their mere arrival altering the course of planetary development. Some may have fallen into worship, abandoning their own ambitions to serve. Others, perhaps more pragmatic, may have recognized the danger in such uninvited contact and sought to repel them, and found that their weapons had no purchase against something that seemed to exist in more than one reality at once. It is tempting to imagine this first contact as a moment of exchange, but the evidence suggests it was instead an act of surveying. The ancient Zenos came, they observed, and they left, often without leaving a trace, save for the disruptions their presence caused in the local warp tides. If they took anything, it was knowledge. If they left anything, it was the seed of awe, and perhaps the first whispers of fear in the hearts of spacefaring beings. Some theories suggest that this was not the beginning of an empire's expansion, but the execution of a design older than the stars themselves. They may have been following a map, not of space but of time. The worlds they visited may have been chosen not for what they were in that age, but for what they would become millions of years later. If that is true, then their first contact with the galaxy was less a moment in history than a move in a game whose rules we still cannot see. And the players who made that move may not have ever stopped playing. The galaxy's first great conflict may not have been a clash of empires in the way we understand it, but a collision of purposes so incompatible that peace was never possible. The earliest records, little more than fragments embedded in planetary strata and warped data echoes in the deep void, suggest that the ancient Xenos encountered rivals whose existence threatened the very stability they seemed to guard. Whether these rivals were another spacefaring species, a creation of the old ones, or something native to the warp itself, we cannot say. What is clear is that the response was swift, merciless, and absolute. It is telling that no clear remains of their adversaries have ever been found. Where battles took place, the evidence points not to occupation or subjugation, but to obliteration. Planets reduced to fields of glass, moons shattered into debris clouds, and stars left to collapse in sudden, unnatural deaths. In every known instance, the destruction was precise, as though calculated to remove the target from the cosmic order without disturbing the surrounding systems. This was not war as a tool of expansion, it was war as a form of pruning, cutting away what could not be permitted to grow. One theory among radical mechanicus xenologists proposes that this ancient species may have been fighting an enemy capable of reshaping the warp in real space, a proto-demonic force, or perhaps a predatory psychic organism that fed on emerging civilizations. In that light, their war would not have been conquest, but containment. They may have been the galaxy's immune system, striking swiftly wherever a dangerous anomaly appeared, eliminating it before it could threaten the wider structure. And yet, there are signs that this conflict escalated beyond their control. On certain worlds, ruined sites show signs of hasty abandonment, their carefully aligned structures left unfinished. Some display evidence of being sabotaged from within, as if their own kind turned against the great work. Perhaps the enemy found a way to corrupt them. Perhaps the burden of eternal vigilance fractured their unity. Whatever the cause, the later stages of this first war leave a trail of chaos. Artifacts scattered without pattern, abandoned monitoring stations still humming with unreadable data, and great void constructs adrift in interstellar darkness, stripped of purpose. If the old ones ever knew of this war, they did not record it. Perhaps they saw no reason to. Or perhaps they were warned not to speak of it. The absence of such an ancient, galaxy-spanning conflict, from even their vast knowledge, suggests a deliberate erasure. And when one considers the scale of the power needed to erase both the victors and the vanquished from memory, the conclusion is unavoidable. The first great conflict may have ended not with victory, but with the agreement that it must never be remembered. Their disappearance was neither a slow decline nor a spectacular final battle. It was as if an entire civilization simply chose to step away from reality. One epoch they were there, their presence still marked by strange alignments in the stars, the hum of their artifacts, the invisible weight of their attention, and the next, they were gone. No last transmissions, no debris fields, no evidence of defeat. The only signs of their passing are the empty structures. They're still aligned with precision, still humming with low power, as if waiting for a signal that will never come. Among the Ordo Xenos, there are theories about the nature of this vanishing. The most benign suggests a form of self-imposed exile, that they retreated to a dimension adjacent to the warp, sealed off from the material galaxy to escape some oncoming threat. In this telling, they are not gone, merely dormant, maintaining a distant watch from a place we cannot perceive. Others believe they were driven to extinction by a foe that left no trace, perhaps one they themselves unleashed. A darker theory, whispered only by the most heretical minds, claims that they did not leave at all, that they are still here, scattered invisibly among the substructures of the galaxy, hidden in plain sight as fragments of thought, fields of force, or even patterns in our own genetic code. There are also legends, found in obscure Eldari myth cycles, of a great seal, not a physical barrier, but a pact bound in psychic law. It speaks of a bargain struck at the end of an age, when the first Xenos agreed to disappear in exchange for the survival of the younger races. Such a pact, if real, would explain the utter absence of their presence in the millennia that followed. But it would also suggest that their return could only come if that bargain were broken, perhaps by accident or by the deliberate will of something old enough to remember the terms. The strangest clue lies in their remaining technology. Despite aeons of decay, it resists complete entropy. Energy signatures persist far beyond expected limits, as though these artifacts were designed not to last forever, but to wait forever. Mechanicus studies on a recovered crystal array found in the halo stars revealed a low, rhythmic pulse buried beneath the noise of cosmic background radiation. The pulse was not random, it was a countdown, and according to the Adept's calculations, the final beat will occur within the current millennium. Whether their vanishing was an act of preservation, surrender, or something far stranger, the truth is this: the galaxy has been without their presence for longer than our minds can meaningfully grasp. And yet their works remain, their alignments endure, and their hum still fills the silence, patient, steady, and unending. If they are waiting for something, then the question is not whether they will return, but what event will be great enough to call them back. They were gone for so long that even their myths faded into dust. Yet myths have a way of waiting, hiding in the shadows of memory, until something stirs them awake. The first signs were small, so small that the galaxy's great powers barely noticed. A deep space probe vanished in the void beyond the eastern fringe. A Tau exploration vessel returned to port with its entire crew in a catatonic state, their minds filled with the same incomprehensible hum. An Adeptus Mechanicus listening post in the halo stars detected a repeating signal, one they could not trace to any known source, which ceased the moment they began to triangulate it. It might have been dismissed as coincidence, but then came the dreams. Across a dozen worlds, unconnected psychers began to describe visions of vast, dark corridors stretching between stars, filled with the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. Some imperial authorities assumed demonic influence, yet the Ordo Malleus found no warp taint. In fact, the visions seemed to exist outside the warp entirely, bypassing its currents as though they were using some older, deeper channel of thought. The Eldari were unsettled enough to dispatch rangers into uncharted sectors, though none returned. The trigger, if there was one, remains unknown. Some argue it was the death of a particular star, its light finally reaching the dormant constructs after millions of years. Others whisper of a shift in the warp's great tides, caused by the psychic crescendo of the time of ending, that may have loosened the seals on their exile. The most chilling theory comes from a lone Magos explorator who returned from the edge of the galaxy with his mind fractured, that the ancient Zenos had never been asleep, only watching, and that they chose this moment to act because the galaxy was finally weak enough to be reshaped. What followed was not an invasion. It was a reappearance, slow and deliberate. Long-dead structures awoke in the void, shedding the dust of millennia as if it were nothing. Beams of impossible light cut across interstellar space, not to destroy but to connect, forming lattices between worlds, aligning systems in ways no chart could predict. On certain planets, monoliths buried deep underground rose to the surface, humming with that same rhythmic pulse first detected centuries earlier. For most of the galaxy, the truth has yet to dawn. To the Imperium, these are scattered anomalies, unconnected events soon to be crushed under the weight of more immediate crises. To the Tau, they are mysteries to study. To the Eldari, they are an echo of a dread they cannot quite name. But for those who have studied the forbidden ruins and heard the hum in their dreams, there is no doubt the first Xenos have returned, and they have not come back to reclaim the past. They have come to finish what they began before history itself had a name. Their first engagements in this new age were not grand battles to shake the galaxy, but surgical, almost experimental. A void station on the fringes of Imperial space, fully crewed and armed, simply vanished from Auspex records one moment and reappeared hours later with every occupant dead, their bodies unmarked, but their eyes clouded black. A Tau Pathfinder team on an unclaimed world reported contact with what they believed was an Eldari construct, until its surface shifted, revealing patterns and geometries that caused two of the team to collapse in seizures before it melted into the ground like water. A Necron tomb ship, long dormant, abruptly activated and changed course to pursue an unknown object, ignoring all other intrusions until both it and its target slipped into the void without trace. These were not acts of open war. They were probes. The first Xenos, it seemed, were testing the galaxy's reflexes, assessing the strength and nature of its current inhabitants. Some encounters resulted in annihilation, others in observation. In rare cases, the Xenos left artifacts behind, inscrutable devices that resisted all attempts at reverse engineering, yet produced strange effects when placed near psychers, such as inducing moments of perfect silence in the warp. It is worth noting that their actions appeared to bypass any sense of political boundaries. They struck in Imperial space, in Tau-held regions, in Orc-infested sectors, even in the barren wastes that no faction claimed. The Orcs, predictably, saw them as a challenge worth pursuing, though any warbands sent to engage them either failed to find their quarry or never returned at all. The few that did return spoke in oddly hushed tones about stars turning inside out and tunnels into black where the fight never ends. For the Eldar, these reappearances provoked something deeper than fear, a quiet, unspoken recognition. In hushed councils, their seers acknowledged that they had felt this presence before, in the oldest folds of their racial memory, and that it had been a harbinger of calamity. Even the Harlequins, usually given to mocking mystery, were said to have closed their performances with long silences, as though unwilling to speak certain truths aloud. The Imperium's first direct military engagement with them occurred when a patrol group from Battlefleet Obscurus intercepted what they believed to be an unidentified Xenos craft near the edge of the Halo stars. The ensuing encounter was brief and one-sided. Vox recordings recovered from the wreckage contain a short burst of static, followed by the voice of the fleet's captain saying, "They are not here for us," before the signal cuts out entirely. What that meant and who they are here for remains unknown. The message of these first skirmishes is clear. The galaxy is once again under their gaze, and they are not acting out of hunger, conquest, or vengeance. They are executing a plan that began before the birth of the species now watching them with dread. The realization, when it came, did not arrive in a single moment. It spread slowly, like a shadow lengthening at the end of a long day. Across the Imperium, scattered reports began to surface of deep unrest among psychers, of dreams that did not belong to the dreamer, of sudden panic in the quietest of minds. In the Eldari craft worlds, ancient seers retreated into long silences, their eyes fixed on points that no one else could see. Even the Tyranids, those unrelenting engines of consumption, altered their advance in certain sectors, bypassing regions where the first Xenos were known to act. It was not fear of battle. It was avoidance, as if even the Great Devourer recognized something too dangerous to consume. The psychological impact was profound. Humanity, for all its stubborn arrogance, thrives on the illusion that it is central to the galaxy's fate. The Eldari cling to the belief that their ancient tragedies and prophecies are the axis on which history turns. The Necrons act as though their awakening is the defining moment of this era. But the return of the first Xenos shattered those illusions. Here was a force so old, so removed from the familiar narratives of conquest and revenge, that it reduced every other empire to the status of bystanders. On some worlds, cults began to form around the returned presence. These were not like the chaotic, frenzied gatherings of heretics. They were quiet, almost reverent. The cultists did not pray for salvation or power. They simply sought to align themselves, physically and mentally, with the patterns they believed the ancient Xenos followed. Cities saw strange gatherings in open plazas, where participants stood unmoving for hours under the night sky, eyes fixed on constellations long forgotten by imperial charts. For the Imperium's leaders, the challenge was twofold. Militarily, they could not strike at an enemy that did not engage in conventional warfare. Psychologically, they could not admit the existence of a force that predated the oldest myths without risking widespread panic and collapse of faith. The Administratum quietly suppressed reports, the Ecclesiarchy declared the phenomena to be false visions of the warp, and the Inquisition split into factions, some advocating immediate extermination efforts, others arguing for cautious observation, and a few daring to suggest communication. The Eldar fared no better. The Craftworld councils argued endlessly, some seeing the return as a chance to learn truths older than their own gods, others fearing that to even seek such knowledge would invite ruin. The Harlequins, it was said, refused to speak of them directly, instead performing dances that ended with the stage left empty, the audience unsure whether the play had truly ended. It became clear that the first Xenos had no need to fire a single weapon to reshape the galaxy. Their mere presence was enough to unsettle the foundation of every culture, to strip away the comforting illusion that the known races were the rightful inheritors of the stars. And for some, that was the most terrifying weapon of all. The galaxy's descent into war with the first Xenos was not a clean shift from peace to conflict. It was a creeping inevitability. Their presence, once scattered and subtle, began to coalesce into deliberate action. Lattice-like constructs that once hung dormant in the void now pulsed with coherent energy, drawing power from nearby stars. Warp routes that had been stable for millennia twisted without warning, isolating entire systems. On the eastern fringe, an entire Imperial Crusade fleet vanished into a corridor of space that collapsed behind them, leaving only the fading echo of the ancient hum. At first, these events were seen as unconnected disasters. But soon it became clear that they were part of a larger pattern, a slow rearrangement of the galaxy's infrastructure. Systems were being linked or severed in ways no human or Xenos strategist could explain. When the Tau attempted to chart the changes, they found that the new connections matched no logical trade or military pattern, yet formed precise geometric alignments when viewed on a galactic scale. War finally erupted when an Imperial expeditionary force, supported by a Mechanicus fleet, attempted to dismantle one of the largest active constructs in the Halo stars. The structure responded by bending the local gravity well, hurling entire cruisers into collision courses with one another, before shattering them into debris that fell neatly into the nearby gas giant. The survivors reported no return fire, only the structure's silent continuation of its task, as though swatting away interference without malice or urgency. The Necrons, perhaps seeing in the first Xenos a rival claim to the galaxy's ancient architecture, began to mobilize in force. Dynasties that had been silent since their awakening now stirred, their tomb fleets moving along routes that paralleled the ancient constructs. Reports emerged of battles between Necron ships and the unknown entities, fought in total silence and without witnesses, save for the occasional drifting wreck found afterward. The nature of these engagements remains unclear, but one thing is certain. The Necrons treat them not as prey or pests, but as opponents worthy of respect. For the Orcs, the war was a new kind of challenge. Warlords who managed to track the elusive enemy often returned frustrated, claiming the shiny gits refused to fight proper, disappearing just when the best battles were about to begin. Yet those few Orc vessels that did make contact and survive brought back tales of weapons that did not explode or burn, but instead froze entire mobs mid-charge, locking them in place until they crumbled to dust. The conflict's greatest horror for the Imperium was its intangibility. There was no enemy fleet to destroy, no capital world to besiege, no hierarchy to decapitate. The war was fought in patterns, alignments, and vanishings, in changes to the shape of space itself. And always, somewhere beyond sight, the hum continued. Steady, patient, and utterly without fear. In the end, the war with the first Xenos was never truly about territory or dominance. It was about the galaxy's shape, about the very order of reality itself. Their actions, spread across thousands of light years, left no doubt that they were building towards something. Though whether it was a defense, a weapon, or a transformation, none could say. And yet, for all their incomprehensible aims, the mark they left on the galaxy was not only physical, but philosophical. For humanity, their return was a brutal reminder that the Imperium is not the inevitable culmination of history, but a transient structure in a cosmos that has known greater, older powers. For the Eldari, it was a confrontation with the fact that they were not the firstborn of the stars, and that their gods had perhaps been merely tenants in a universe shaped by others. For the Necrons, it was a challenge to their claim of being the last and most enduring survivors of the ancient age, a challenge they could not easily dismiss. The legacy of the first Xenos lies in the questions they force upon the living. How many cycles of civilization has the galaxy endured before this one? How many times has the very shape of the stars been rewritten by hands long since turned to dust? And most chillingly is what we see now. This familiar map of constellations, this web of warp routes, merely a temporary arrangement awaiting the next correction event. There are those who believe that when the first Xenos have completed their work, they will vanish again, leaving the younger races to live in the shape they have imposed. Others argue that their presence now is permanent, that the age of shaping is ending, and the age of ruling will follow. But there are darker voices still. Those who claim that their task is not to preserve the galaxy, but to end it, folding it back into whatever strange order existed before even the old ones walked the stars. In every rumor, in every half-buried account, there is one constant: the hum. It is said that if you are quiet enough, in the deepest hours of night, you can hear it through the hull of your ship, a slow pulse that seems to echo the beating of your own heart. Some call it a signal, others a warning, and a few whisper that it is neither, that it is simply the heartbeat of the galaxy as it was meant to be, before history, before memory, before us. The war had reached a point where the galaxy itself seemed to shift under its weight. The ancient Xenos were no longer simply altering warp lanes and stellar alignments in isolation. Now their actions directly intersected with the ambitions of the living powers. Imperial crusades found themselves funneled toward sectors where the constructs loomed largest, their fleet paths subtly warped, until they arrived at locations of no strategic value, except perhaps to the first Xenos. Tau expansion fleets reported sudden surges in warp instability, cutting their newly claimed systems off from supply lines until they were forced to abandon them. The Eldari, masters of hidden pathways, found the webway inexplicably reshaping, certain corridors collapsing while others emerged, leading to places no Eldar had set foot since before the fall. At the heart of these disturbances lay what the Adeptus Mechanicus would come to call the Alignment Wars. Though no declaration was made and no unified command gave orders, battle after battle erupted at sites where the first Xenos had begun their work. In some cases, the sites were vast orbital lattices, each node the size of a small moon, tethered together by beams of light that bent but never broke. In others, they were planetary-scale monoliths, their faces covered in patterns that shifted subtly, as though reacting to the presence of hostile minds. The purpose of these structures was still a mystery, but their importance was clear. The ancient Xenos defended them without hesitation, striking with force precise enough to remove threats without collateral destruction. Necron forces were the most persistent opponents, driven by what many suspected was not just territorial rivalry but a philosophical opposition to the Xenos' design. The dynasties viewed themselves as the ultimate inheritors of the Old One's work, the custodians of the galaxy's order. That another, older species could claim such a role was intolerable. Entire tomb fleets descended upon the constructs, unleashing weapons that stripped the molecular bonds from matter itself. Yet the first Xenos met them in silence, responding not with fleets of equal size, but with shapes that emerged directly from the void, as though stepping through from some hidden, parallel space. Witnesses described their vessels as shadows given mass, ships whose outlines shifted depending on the angle of sight, and whose weapons seemed less like projectiles and more like the direct rewriting of reality. The Imperium's attempts to seize these sites were no more successful. Even the might of the Astra Militarum and the Adeptus Astartes faltered against the Xenos' defense. Space Marines reported weapons that bypassed ceramite and flesh alike, not by piercing, but by removing the target from existence entirely, leaving no body, no armor, not even blood, only a faint afterimage that faded like smoke in sunlight. Orbital bombardments failed, the shells curving away from their intended targets as if the very laws of trajectory had been rewritten. And when the Imperium attempted to destroy the constructs from afar with cyclonic torpedoes, the warheads detonated harmlessly, their destructive power dispersed into nothing. The Orcs, of course, refused to acknowledge defeat, launching wave after wave of attacks that were met with almost mocking precision. The first Xenos never wasted effort. They disabled engines, silenced guns, and left mobs stranded on dead worlds, their warlust slowly grinding down into boredom before they sought easier fights elsewhere. Still, the Greenskins adapted in their own brutal way, cobbling together crude imitations of the Xenos' lattice designs, though whether this was instinct, genius, or mere coincidence remains unclear. The strangest confrontations occurred when Tyranid hive fleets blundered into these sites. Normally relentless, the Tyranids behaved oddly in the presence of the constructs, sometimes avoiding them entirely, sometimes attacking with wild, almost desperate ferocity. In the latter cases, the battles were short and catastrophic. The first Xenos annihilated the attacking bioships with an efficiency that suggested deep understanding of Tyranid biology. Yet, in every recorded encounter, the constructs remained intact, and no known Tyranid specimen has ever been recovered from such a battle. Through all of this, one pattern became increasingly clear to the few analysts allowed to study the war at the highest levels. The constructs were not scattered randomly. When plotted on a galactic map, they formed not just lines or shapes, but layers. Vast, three-dimensional grids that extended beyond the edge of known space. The growing fear was that these were not fortifications, but components of a single, galaxy-spanning mechanism. And if the first Xenos were defending them so fiercely now, then the mechanism's activation could not be far off. It was at this point that the Inquisition split in earnest. Some Inquisitors argued for total commitment to destroying the constructs before their purpose could be realized, even if it meant uniting with Xenos' rivals against a common foe. Others urged restraint, fearing that interference might hasten activation or destabilize the very fabric of the galaxy. And a small, dangerous minority argued that the Imperium should attempt to seize control of the mechanism for itself, to claim the ancient power of the first Xenos and wield it as the Emperor's ultimate weapon. The alignment wars would not end with victory for any of the living races. The first Xenos were not fighting to win in the conventional sense. They were fighting to finish. And in the grim calculus of their design, the deaths of billions, the shifting of star systems, and the rewriting of space itself were not tragedies, but steps toward the completion of whatever great work they had begun before history began. The alignment wars entered a phase that no strategist, mortal or otherwise, had anticipated. The galaxy's great powers had begun to treat the conflict less as a war to be won, and more as an inevitable environmental shift. Like a supernova or a warp storm, something to be endured or redirected rather than conquered outright. Yet endurance was proving difficult. The first Xenos had begun moving their constructs into positions perilously close to inhabited systems, and the subtlety of their methods was giving way to undeniable, visible transformation. Whole sectors were reshaped without a single shot fired, their stars reoriented against the galactic background as if the fabric of space itself was being pushed and folded. Imperial cartographers began to report impossible readings, constellations warped into new alignments overnight, distant quasars appearing closer than they should be, and void routes shortening by light years in the span of hours. The changes were not random. Every new configuration aligned with the existing lattice the Xenos were building, as though each system, each star was a bead in a vast string being drawn taut across the galaxy. For the Adeptus Mechanicus, this was both heresy and revelation. Entire sects split over whether the lattice represented a cosmic threat or the ultimate machine, a manifestation of the Omnissiah's design on a galactic scale. Explorators risked their lives and the wrath of the Ordo Xenos to approach active construction sites, some managing to transmit data before being annihilated. Those records, heavily encrypted and rarely shared, hinted that the constructs were not merely structures but harmonics, each emitting resonances in frequencies that ranged from gravitic oscillations to subwarp vibrations. The theory was that these harmonics, once synchronized, would create a standing wave across the galaxy itself. No one knew what that wave would do. Possibilities ranged from stabilizing the warp to collapsing it entirely, from sealing the galaxy off from external threats to tearing open a passage for something unimaginable. The Eldar feared the latter most, whispering of entities older than their gods, bound outside reality, waiting for the precise moment when the galaxy's shape would match the key to their prison. The Necrons, meanwhile, escalated their efforts, awakening dynasties long silent. Reports of silent wars between Necron fleets and the first Xenos multiplied, with entire systems going dark overnight. Yet the Necrons' objectives seemed less about destruction and more about disruption, inserting their own technology into the lattice, subtly altering the alignments. Whether this was to corrupt the design or to claim control of it remained unclear. For the Imperium's military, the most demoralizing fact was that even victory offered no lasting gain. When a construct was destroyed, its absence created a cascade effect through the lattice. Other nodes shifted their positions to compensate, sometimes resulting in even greater strategic disadvantage. It was like trying to unmake a web by plucking at its strands, only to find the spider had woven the disruption into the pattern. Perhaps the most unsettling encounters were the contact zones, areas where the first Xenos' influence bled into inhabited worlds without direct physical presence. In these zones, time became unreliable. Civilians reported hours passing in minutes or days vanishing in an instant. Machinery behaved erratically, sometimes failing outright, other times operating with impossible efficiency. Psychers described hearing the hum as a living voice, speaking not in words but in mathematical truths so absolute that to hear them was to understand that resistance was meaningless. It was in one such contact zone, on the agri world of Foros Beta, that the first recorded attempt at communication occurred. The Ordo Xenos dispatched a specially selected choir of sanctioned psychers, each trained to resist demonic intrusion, to project a message of peace and inquiry. The result was catastrophic. The psychers were rendered brain dead instantly, their bodies still breathing but their minds erased. Yet for 3 days after the attempt, the entire planet experienced a strange serenity. No crimes, no disputes, no accidents. It was as if the will of the inhabitants had been aligned to a single, silent purpose, and then released once the effect faded. The alignment wars, by this point, had claimed countless lives without a single decisive battle. And still, the ancient Xenos showed no signs of exhaustion or desperation. If anything, their movements became more deliberate, their constructs growing in both number and complexity. The galaxy was being rewritten before the eyes of its current rulers, and the living powers could only watch, fight, and fear, knowing that the true purpose of the Great Lattice was still hidden, waiting for the moment of activation. By the time the alignment wars reached their 3rd year, a grim truth had settled upon the galaxy's leaders. This was not a war that could be won through traditional means. The first Xenos had never deployed their full strength, never revealed a central command, never shown a capital world to strike. Instead, they fought like the shifting of tectonic plates, slow, inevitable, and devastating in ways that could not be countered by force alone. Their enemy was not merely the fleets and armies of the living races, but the very shape of the galaxy's reality, which they were methodically remolding. In the eastern fringe, the Tau suffered some of the most dramatic losses. Entire spheres of expansion were suddenly cut off from their core systems, their supply lines severed by warp collapses and gravitational anomalies that rendered even advanced FTL drives useless. Worse still, the first Xenos seemed to deliberately allow certain Tau enclaves to remain untouched, not as an act of mercy, but as though they served some role in the larger design. Those enclaves often reported strange sightings in the sky, faintly luminous arcs that crossed the horizon at impossible speeds, and geometries forming among the stars that were invisible to augurs, yet burned themselves into the memory of any who looked up. In Imperial space, the story was one of attrition and frustration. The Astra Militarum deployed regiment after regiment to protect key systems, only for those systems to shift out of alignment, making their defense strategically irrelevant. The Adeptus Astartes fared little better. Even the mightiest chapters found themselves drawn into skirmishes where victory meant nothing more than buying a few more hours before the constructs completed their work. Space Marines spoke of fighting in zones where the laws of motion themselves seemed to falter. Bolter rounds curving away from their targets, jump packs firing in silence as if the air had been stolen from around them. The Orcs, ever drawn to the prospect of a good fight, continued to hurl themselves into the fray, but their enthusiasm began to wane. The first Xenos did not offer the catharsis of battle the Greenskins craved. Instead, the Orcs found themselves stranded, tricked into fighting in places where the enemy simply vanished, leaving them to squabble among themselves. Some war bosses, in rare displays of caution, began to steer their fleets away from the lattice entirely, muttering that "dares no propa scrap in fighting ghosts." The Eldari's involvement grew more desperate. They began deploying hidden craftworld fleets, and even risking the exposure of long-lost Exodite worlds in an attempt to disrupt the Xenos alignments. The Harlequins, whose role in the war had been sporadic and cryptic, staged a series of elaborate interventions, sudden, dazzling assaults on key lattice points that were over as quickly as they began. But these attacks rarely achieved lasting success. Within days, the constructs would simply realign, as though the damage had been anticipated from the start. Rumors spread of factions within the Inquisition, making contact with radical Mechanicus sects to explore a horrifying alternative: hijacking the lattice. The idea was met with outrage in official circles, but the prospect of controlling a galaxy-spanning mechanism capable of rewriting the laws of space and time was too great a temptation for some to resist. The danger, of course, was obvious. Without full understanding of the lattice's purpose, seizing control might unleash forces that no living mind could contain. And always, in the background, the hum persisted. In every theater of war, no matter the faction or the distance, it could be felt by those sensitive to its rhythm. Some began to report hearing variations, a deepening tone here, a rising pitch there, as though the lattice was speaking, or perhaps counting down. The changes were subtle, but they were enough to stir a growing dread among those who listened too closely. By the war's midpoint, the galaxy's maps had already begun to lose their relevance. Warp routes were not just disrupted but replaced, making old star charts dangerous and outdated. Entire campaigns collapsed when fleets emerged from the warp into systems that no longer existed in their original positions. And still, the first Xenos gave no explanation, no threat, no ultimatum. To them, the war was not a contest, but a process. And they were patient enough to see it through to the end. By the fourth year of the Alignment Wars, the conflict had taken on a rhythm as strange and alien as its architects. Every major faction had learned, in their own way, that direct confrontation yielded little gain. Yet the first Xenos continued their silent labor, threading their vast lattice through the galaxy like a spider weaving in slow, deliberate circles. The difference now was that the living races had begun to adapt, not in the sense of turning the tide, but in the manner of creatures learning to survive alongside a predator they could not kill. For the Imperium, adaptation meant compartmentalization. The Administratum quietly reclassified entire sectors as structurally compromised and diverted resources away from them, focusing on preserving more stable territories. Official propaganda downplayed the first Xenos entirely, describing them as nothing more than another Xenos pest to be eradicated in time. But within the Inquisition, the truth was plain. This was not a temporary threat. The galaxy was changing, and if the Imperium could not stop it, it would have to learn to function within whatever new reality emerged. The Tau, by contrast, viewed the war as an opportunity for study. Their watercaste negotiated risky truces with Imperial and even Eldari forces in order to share intelligence. Some Firecaste commanders even began adjusting fleet movements to follow the lattice's expansion, using it as a navigational advantage in sectors where it bent space to shorten travel time. But this opportunism came at a cost. Entire colonies vanished when their positions intersected with key nodes in the lattice. There were no survivors, and no wreckage was found. The Necrons, tireless in their opposition, had begun deploying weapons of a scale not seen since the War in Heaven. Vast inertial dampening fields were projected across systems to slow the lattice's construction, while colossal monoliths were planted like stakes to anchor local space in place. Yet even these measures were temporary at best. The first Xenos would withdraw, allow the Necron machinery to settle, and then return months later to simply bypass or dissolve it, their designs unbroken. Some Necron overlords began to suspect that their efforts were not hindering the enemy at all, but testing its defenses, as if the first Xenos welcomed the challenge. Perhaps the strangest front of the war lay in the so-called zones of double sky, regions where the lattice's influence bent light and gravity in ways that produced impossible astronomical effects. Ships navigating these areas reported seeing two versions of the same starfield, one accurate to known charts, the other altered, showing constellations that did not exist anywhere in the present galaxy. The Mechanicus theorized that these second skies were projections of the galaxy as it would look after the lattice was complete. If true, it meant that the first Xenos were not merely changing the galaxy's current state, they were showing glimpses of its future. The Orcs remained unpredictable participants. Some warbands had entirely abandoned the war, seeking more satisfying fights elsewhere, but others had become obsessed with the Ghost Gits, believing that defeating them would make a war boss the greatest in the galaxy. These obsessed factions launched ever larger assaults on lattice nodes, occasionally achieving momentary victories that were celebrated in Orc legend, but which the lattice soon erased, rebuilding as though nothing had happened. Even the Tyranids seemed to waver. Hive fleets that once drove straight through lattice territories began diverting around them, as if instinctively avoiding interference. And yet, on rare occasions, splinter fleets would hurl themselves at the constructs with suicidal intensity, as if obeying some hidden command. The result was always the same: complete annihilation with no biomass recovered, as though the very matter of the Tyranids had been unmade. In the midst of this chaos, a disturbing pattern emerged. The hum, that eternal patient pulse, began to sync with certain astronomical cycles. Every time a massive star collapsed into a black hole or a neutron star emitted a pulse toward a key lattice node, the hum would deepen, analysts began to suspect that the lattice was using the galaxy's own stellar life cycle as part of its power source, feeding on events that were both natural and inevitable. By this stage, the war had claimed more lives through displacement, famine, and collapse of infrastructure than through direct combat. And still, the first Xenos had not once engaged in the kind of apocalyptic slaughter so common to the 41st millennium. To them, death was not the goal. It was merely a side effect of shaping the galaxy. And that, more than anything, was what made them terrifying. They were not trying to win. They were trying to finish. The return of the first Xenos is not merely another chapter in the endless wars of the 41st millennium. It is a reminder that we are not the authors of this story, but only its latest actors. And if you wish to hear more tales of the galaxy's hidden past, of secrets buried beneath millennia of blood and steel, then subscribe, for there are truths yet to be told, and some, perhaps, best left in silence.